Your Excellencies, dear friends, and of course here I include our online audience who are watching this. A warm welcome to all of you at the International Peace Institute. We're delighted to see you here at what is a special event, not least that it's the first event we've had really post-COVID, but more especially it's to introduce the art, and if I could put it this way, perhaps more crucially, the subject of the art of an artist who's absolutely remarkable, a human rights activist and a humanitarian, and someone, and please take this from me, it's going to happen, someone who will become one of the most important activist artists or artist activists of her generation, Hannah Rose Thomas. And so welcome, Hannah. I will get into I will delve into a little bit more detail about Hannah in a moment, but this exhibition and reception and the discussion we're going to have would only be possible, or could only be possible, with the support of others. And first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the generosity of the Grace Farms Foundation and its founder, the indomitable Sharon Prince. Thank you for your support and thank you for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the permanent mission of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, and I'm delighted that Dame Barbara Woodward, the permanent representative and ambassador of the United Kingdom, is here with us. Likewise, I'd like to acknowledge the support of UNESCO. Hannah is, after all, a UNESCO scholar at the University of Glasgow, pursuing her PhD. Not now, obviously, but when she goes back to Glasgow. And we're delighted that Mr. Elliot Mitchenberg, the director of the UNESCO office, is with us, and welcome. And finally, we have the support, and we feel very privileged to have the support of UN Women, and Åsa Regner, the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director, is with us. So thank you to all of you. When I first heard about Hannah, I was told that there was the star graduate of the Prince's School of Traditional Arts in London, the Prince being His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, and that I had to write a foreword to an upcoming book of this artist. Admittedly, I initially was a little bit reluctant because I had so much work to do. And so I logged on to Hannah's website, and I noticed something that every UN official will be very familiar with. If you've worked with the UN, you would have visited, and not just worked for the UN, but any organization or indeed in government, you would have visited countless refugee camps and IDP camps. And often we would turn up, we would sit and listen to the refugees or the IDPs. We try and convey what they're telling us to the media and to the various organs in the UN. But never did we go in trying to bring joy to the children who would be teeming around us, or to the families. And when I saw Hannah and the photographs of her with Syrian refugees in Jordan, putting a big canvas on the floor and bringing paint, and paint was going everywhere, and the children are laughing. It may not solve the crisis, but for the people living in the camp, it brings some joy to them. And I thought, why didn't I think of this myself? Not that I could paint at all, but somehow bring art closer to peace and security, the humanitarian field, and human rights. So for me, it's a very special occasion this to have Hannah join us today, and we'll have a discussion shortly. Before that, though, I'd very much like it if Sharon would come up and say a few words, followed by Barbara, by Elliot, and Åsa. So Sharon, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Zeid, for setting this exceptional evening and afternoon up. I also want to thank you for the partnerships that we have here today, not only International Peace Institute, UNESCO, UN Women, and UK Mission to the UN. It is particularly important to me because at Grace Farms, we've been partnering with all of you in some capacity since we opened in 2015 to address modern day slavery and gender-based violence. So we have camaraderie here. This is a particularly important way to thread the arts through something that we know we've been prioritizing at Grace Farms since we opened. Grace Farms is an hour from here in Connecticut, and we've had many convenings, but also itself is a place that we've been prioritizing art through space, architecture, and also justice. And so we've been fusing art with nature, community, justice, and faith. And what has actually emerged are new outcomes that we want to happen. There's a sense of urgency with these issues that we are dealing with. And by being in a space that breaks down barriers between people and sectors, and by being in a hopeful space when you're dealing with such dark issues, is actually creating momentum. And this is what I see here happening today. Design for Freedom actually has been was identified. Design for Freedom itself is a movement that has identified a gaping human rights violation within the construction sector. And we are creating this radical paradigm shift within the construction sector, which is the largest industrialized sector in the world that is at the highest risk of forced and child labor. Think about it. First, we think about food and clothing that has been called to be accountable for an ethical and sustainable supply chains. And we're proposing and asking that shelter be prioritized. And the reason why that's important is that the victims of forced and child labor, those that are those that have been a part of that are part of the supply chain. Those that you're depicting in your work, the refugees, men, women, and children. And so there's a power in being able to use what we have. So in terms of our ability to, with our conscious consumerism, but also in what we are able to digest. I think this is a moment now for us to really be able to hear the stories, what you're depicting in terms of surfacing injustices, fostering community and human dignity through your work is really very powerful. And then also pursuit of peace and reconciliation. So I am really heartened by what you've done without words and cannot wait to hear what you have to say together with words. So thank you for this. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And Zeid, thank you very much indeed for convening us today. And I'm delighted that we have been able to partner with you at IPI, with Grace Farms, and to co-host this astonishing exhibition. And thank you all for coming. Hannah's work really speaks for itself, doesn't it? But for me, it encapsulates the human aspects of crises that we discuss a lot here in New York, but it feels so much more abstract. And these paintings, I think, render the stories and the people, the women behind them, they bring to life, yes, the horror, but also the heroism of women who are affected by conflict. It's an astonishing achievement, Hannah. Thank you. And I think your paintings remind me, and I'm sure others in the room, that alongside humanity's ability to inflict incredible suffering, stands alongside that a profound capacity for resilience, for dignity, for reconciliation. And fundamentally, they remind us why we're here. Hannah's paintings remind us too that women and girls continue to suffer the brunt of conflict and violence, but they are by themselves powerful agents for transformation. but you too, in the work that you've done in the camps, bringing moments of joy, memories of joy to children, which is so important, are doing an astonishing job, and thank you for that. I think that often here in New York, we can forget that political processes, I've just come from a Security Council meeting, obscure the fact that really peace is built on a bedrock of far less tangible social and cultural and community links. And art and education have a very profound and important part to play in that respect as instruments themselves, as instruments of advocacy. So thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Zeid, for bringing us together. And thank you all for joining us. I too look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to discuss a topic that is so anchored in UNESCO's mandate. We've been fighting for this for so long at UNESCO to put this topic high on the agenda of the UN. And thanks to people like Hannah, we can make it happen. It's been a long, long fight to have this at the UN. It still is every day. You know, UNESCO was created after the Second World War with this idea that political and economic arrangements are not enough to maintain peace, that you need peace to order to have peace, you need to address the mutual understanding between people, the identity of the people, ensuring cooperation between countries and people to understand each other. And this can be done, of course, through education, rooted in culture, through scientific cooperation, and so on. And again, this fight has been very long, and I'm so happy that we're here. 3 years ago, and Madam Ambassador, you mentioned the Security Council. 3 years ago, it's almost 4 now, we succeeded to have the recognition that culture should be addressed as a peace and security issue at the Security Council. Can you imagine only 3 years ago that was possible? And we're still fighting for this, the recognition that this is a serious issue that should be taken into account. And it's not by mistake that everywhere we see there is a war, that culture and arts are being attacked. We saw it during the Second World War. The Nazis burned the books. It's not by mistake they choose to burn the books. They burned the books because they knew that this is how you destroy the identity of the people. It's not by mistake that the Taliban destroyed the Buddha of Bamiyan. We all saw these terrible pictures at the time. We saw it in Mali. We see it now in Ukraine and in many parts of the world. So they do this because they know that this is how you touch the identity of the people. And if we do not protect that, what remains at the end? What remains, it is the identity of the people, and it's also sometimes, very often, I would say, the shared identity of the people and the belligerent sometimes. And this is the best way to reconstruct after the war. So we should preserve that. And Hannah has been helping us. I have to say, she's been working with UNESCO for a while now, and we look forward to strengthening this partnership as well with her and other artists that are activists. We have a new program called Artivists. That's a new program, which is quite nice. But she's a great representative of that fight that we have been trying, and the voice of the civil society is so important. I mean, there is so much that we at the UN and certain member states can do, but we need people like you, Anna, to advance this struggle and to make it, known to the world. I would just end by saying that, and you mentioned that, Ambassador, the role of education, arts education is essential. It's about teaching kids, creativity, innovation. It's about also putting them together so they can play and they can understand each other. It's about critical thinking. So this is one, I would say, one of the priorities of UNESCO as well, is to work with member states and making sure that arts education is fully integrated in the education programs in every curricula, in every school in the world. So the fight continues, I would say, and thank you again, Prince Zeid, for organizing this, and happy to be your co-host.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zeid. Thank you, Grace Farms. Well, IPI, of course, but also Grace Farms. Thank you, everybody who is here. And most of all, thank you, Hannah,
These portraits and this art is absolutely amazing. And when I came in here, I was thinking that obviously we have to speak about the fact that women in many war zones are victims for sure, but they're certainly also leaders. And I think you can see that in your paintings. And I was thinking that you play with history of art in a very graceful way. And the few portraits that we have of women have that in them, although we need to almost explain that women are also leaders. And I think that you've really very, very moving. Thank you so much. I also think that we all know that when in armed conflicts and wars, women and girls do face disproportionate impacts and very far-reaching consequences. And I'm sure many of us have been to Maiduguri, for example, and it's not something you forget when you sit down and talk with these women. They will remember and have this in their lives for the rest of their lives. And we have to, for them and with them, more importantly, rectify long-standing inequalities. And we have to, with them in the driver's seat, help build resilient and peaceful societies. And women need to be at the center at that recovery, both because it's their right, but also because we know societies become more sustainable when we do. And so I wanted to say a few things of what we need to do. So we need to, in order to achieve this, work with these courageous women so that they can be part of meaningful, so that they can be part of decision making, and so that their proposals and the decisions they claim actually are the decisions we make. They just need to be at the table, something that is unfortunately not reality today. We must also support local peace building and women in the communities. And I think these texts show us exactly why. And that is also something that is hampered today, not least because women's organizations are either not funded at all or heavily underfunded. At the same time, those who work against gender equality seem to have a lot of financing right now. I think we are in a country where we recently saw an example of that. One tool that we have in conflict situations is the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which targets women's organizations directly. And UN Women is proud to host this fund, and we have been working with women's organizations, for example, in Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. We also have to work on protection of women and women peace builders and human rights defenders. They live very dangerous lives right now. This is true in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Yemen, Libya, Tigray, and in many other places. And these complex situations won't be solved until women's voices are heard. You manage to raise the very complex issues of sexual violence in armed conflicts, of trafficking, of women, the need and the lack of women's leadership. And I do hope for myself and for the work coming up. We have the General Assembly in front of us. We have the open debate in the Security Council. And I love that everybody wants to talk about this as I am doing right now. But I want, for when we meet maybe next year, I promise all of you that I will do everything I can to be even more concrete in action. And I think we have to take that step now. It's important to talk, but we need to walk. Otherwise, these women will never get the justice that they deserve. Thank you very much.
So, Hannah, please come center stage. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask Hannah to introduce her friends to us, the survivors of some of the most appalling things that a human can experience. And maybe survivor is too strong a term. They have managed to get through from day to day. And as also said, it's hard for us to judge how and when someone overcomes a trauma. Perhaps they're the only ones that can properly do this. So with all modesty, I think we'll approach a discussion about Hannah's friends. And then I'd like to, at a later stage, talk about the relationship between an artist and these sorts of settings, and then the relationship between art in general and peace and security, the absence of it, and the humanitarian conditions, the human rights violations that obtain. So Hannah, again, welcome. And if I could ask you to start off by introducing us to Samkina, sorry, a Rohingya who stares at us, maybe not stares, from the center of this board. And you have expressed her rather differently. So if you could tell us who Samkina is and what is her story?
Zeid, thank you for the kind introduction, and all of you here as well. Thank you for your kind words. It's an honor to have brought these portraits here. First time in the US. So to begin with this portrait of Samkina, who I met in Kutupalong refugee camp in Bangladesh. This was in 2018. Just 6 months after they had fled after the mass exodus from Myanmar, after the persecution from the Myanmar military. Their stories were heartrending to hear. And Samkina herself, she spoke of her village being set ablaze by the military, and many villagers were pushed into burning buildings, burned alive. And she had to leave her father's body behind. So she spoke of that grief of her and her brother and sister. They were able to flee, but her father's body, they had to just abandon. And they had a long journey through the jungle without food and water. And I remember her saying that even if they did find food to eat, that the smell of corpses made them vomit. So they were kind of scrambling through the jungle. The military were all around these villages blazing. So the stories, I came back and I had nightmares for a few weeks. Just every single image, just like the blazing villages, was just sharply in my mind. And I think this kind of influenced if you want, going into the kind of painting method, you can almost see this chiaroscuro painting method that's from the Renaissance. There's like kind of almost a flickering fire effect, the kind of the light across the skin, and the colors are all flame colors. There are 8 portraits of the Rohingya women I did in total, and to share their stories. And they're all in this kind of fiery colors, and it was that which stayed with me from that trip, from the stories that I heard. And I was doing some painting with the children as well in some of the child-friendly spaces, and yeah, there was a lot of laughter, a lot of joy in the midst of it all, but a lot of children who were so traumatized by what they'd seen. Our parents being killed in front of their eyes, that they couldn't even, there was some cowering in the corner of the shelters. They just couldn't get up. The trauma that they had witnessed is just beyond what can be imagined.
And there's, I suppose, 2 forms of trauma: the effects of violence on you as a person, and then on those who are loved ones. And it could often be both. In the case of Esther and Christina, or Charity here, sorry, I should come this way perhaps. They have similar stories, don't they? In the sense that they were both brutalized by Boko Haram. And then when they returned to their families, in both cases, I think they were pregnant, is that right? They were spurned by their husbands. One beat, I think it was Charity who was beaten by her husband. And Esther was sort of almost ostracized, right? And did you feel that these were broken human beings, or these were human beings who are partially broken? Because it's almost inevitable that they would be, any of us would be, and that they're somehow recovering or able to recover. Is that too almost flippant a use of a term? I mean, how can you recover? You don't recover easily like that. But could you introduce them to us?
So Charity and Esther, they're both survivors of Boko Haram. So I met them in northern Nigeria. I was out there organizing an art workshop through Open Doors. And so there was a group of women, it was a trauma healing art workshop. So I was teaching the women how to paint their portraits as a way to share their stories with the rest of the world. So the idea was really that kind of there's a lot of conversations around trauma healing where the importance of creating a safe space for the sharing of story is a way to facilitate space for healing. So the idea was through the medium of art to create that kind of space for these women. And I think I can't even begin to comprehend what they have suffered. But I did see over the course of our week or so together, just beginnings to open up, sharing their stories together. And there was a transformation that happened there. It's the too glib a word perhaps to say, but there was joy there. There's something about in the paintings, there's a lot of grief. So they painted their self-portraits. So the exhibition's called Tears of Gold because the women chose to paint their portraits with gold tears. But it's in the focus of the drawing and the drawing of the tears. There was a lot of, the atmosphere was totally silent and quiet, and there was no, it was completely still. But then we bought some fabric, Nigerian fabric, for them to sew onto their paintings. But that was like the third day or something together, and there was a lot of singing and laughter. And they said something about that journey through grief, like this process of lament into creating space for joy. So how I think the importance of having a space to be heard, to be witnessed, for your grief and pain to be witnessed, doesn't take it away by any means, but I think does create space for some form of healing to happen. It's not something I fully understand at all by any means, but their stories were heartrending. And I think for the Nigerian women, it was a stigma that they faced in returning to their families, that the double trauma of having been in Boko Haram captivity 3 years and then returning home only to be rejected by their communities. I think that was heartbreaking for me to even think about that double trauma.
Yeah. And if we could then move to Christina next to Charity, her story is slightly different because if you could lead us into it. And also in one way, Hadiya also has a similar story, but perhaps different scale. So if you could introduce both Christina and Hadiya.
Christiana, she was...
Oh, Christiana, sorry.
Christiana, she was experienced rape at the hands of the Fulani militants in northern Nigeria. So it's an ongoing, it's been declared by the British government as an unfolding genocide in northern Nigeria by Fulani militants against Christian women, Christian communities. And so her house was invaded and she was raped 8 months pregnant, and 2 Fulani militants raped her. The third refused to because she was 8 months pregnant. But her husband was tied up and forced to watch. But she called her baby Gloria because she was rushed to the hospital and her baby actually survived. So that she said that's her miracle baby. And I think one thing that struck me particularly with the Nigerian women, they had that shared faith, and it was that which brought them comfort, and their faith that they spoke of, like even through their suffering, was just remarkable as well. That was a resilient, like there are just no words that really can express that. And Hadiya, so she was a Yazidi woman I met in northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017. These women are all survivors of ISIS captivity. I was similarly doing an art workshop where I was teaching the women to paint their self-portraits to share with the rest of their stories. And Hadiya was my age, but she'd been sold to 12 different men during her time in ISIS captivity. And she said it was that act of being repeatedly sold that was what dehumanized her, that experienced as dehumanizing that.
And the other 2 survivors, it's almost, I think, for any parent, it almost takes suffering into a different dimension. I mean, it's so heartbreaking. But if you could also introduce then Fahima and Basta, please.
Fahima and Basseh both still had children in ISIS captivity. And Basseh, she said she was separated from her 6-year-old daughter And she managed to escape, but her daughter did not. And she just said that day and night, she just cannot stop imagining what Daesh are doing to her. And I think this is one of the reasons why I painted these portraits in the style of icons, so drawing from sacred painting methods, tradition of images of the Virgin Mary and her grief for her son who was lost, because the women, their stories weren't about so much about what they suffered in ISIS hands, it was about grief for the loved ones that they had lost. And so they wanted to be portrayed through that lens of grief, and their paintings are also express that story of grief. And I think so much in mass media, we were hearing so much about ISIS slavery and sexual slavery and all these kind of concepts that are very other, very distant and hard to relate to. But when we hear a story of a mother who's separated from her daughter, we can enter into it, we can understand or begin to comprehend that pain is unbearable to us to even consider. But it gives us a lens to begin to understand or empathize with what these women have endured.
And she found her daughter on a website, did she not, as well?
Being sold into
slavery, age
yeah.
6 years old. Fahima can't even look up. Her story is similarly, so it's a 4-year-old son. Did she ever find out what happened to her son?
So I never heard whether she found out about what happened to her son, but some of the other women, their children were restored to them since I met them, which was amazing to hear that they were still returning back.
If we can move now to the center, and we have Zainab, who has another, gut-wrenching story. If you could introduce Zainab to us, please.
Zainab is a young artist from Palestine, and she actually just had an exhibition with UN Women, I believe in Gaza, where she painted her portraits, her pictures of her grief from this last year. So a year ago, on 16th of May 2021, she lost 22 members of her family in an airstrike in Gaza. So incomprehensible grief that she has been through this past year that she channeled into these paintings. And so she says she's 22 years old and she's lost 22 people. And her resilience, her story is remarkable again. And her father described her paintings. He said that before her paintings were full of color, full of life, but now they are full of pain, and again, cannot even begin to comprehend. But she told me that one of the reasons that she'd agreed for her portrait to be painted was that her sister, 16-year-old sister, who was killed, was called Hannah. And that was the connection that she agreed for me to paint her portrait.
Absolutely astonishing, Hannah. When one considers, as Elliot was mentioning, the power of art, the power that can be generated by a skilled artist in conveying stories. It's a different form of artist, and clearly you've put yourself in a position where, unlike many other artists, where it's all about the artist, you've always seemed to me someone more concerned about them than about promoting yourself. It's just a byproduct that you've been recognized in parliaments in Europe and in the UK and in Scotland, and you've been recognized by large organizations. But what I always found compelling with you is that you are in the service of other people. It's not that you are promoting yourself, which is, I find, some sort of more distasteful thing that others may do. But one cannot also divorce one's own feelings when you apply paint to panel, right? So these are not photographs. There's a part of you in this. Did you find, because I'm clearly moving you in this direction, but did you find that you can very easily, and I dare say also is in that situation as well, that you are experiencing secondhand trauma almost yourself, that it's inevitable that when you sit with survivors, no matter how strong they are, you feel sort of weakness within, because you think to yourself, not least, how could I ever have survived anything like that? right? Just by trying to put yourself in that position. And so what is it that Hannah Rose Thomas invests into these panels from herself?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I would agree with you, Zeid. I think it is inevitable. There's no way you can come away unaffected by these stories, by these experiences. As I'm sure all of you who've had these experiences of hearing stories, as I know you've had experience hearing stories of mass atrocities, you come away deeply affected beyond words. And I guess it's one of the ways I use these sacred painting methods like icon painting, because they are a form of prayer that in historically. And so almost when I come back, I immerse myself in this process of painting the portraits as a way to pour out my heart for the stories of the women that I've heard, that also I can't really begin to put to words. And so I think it's a way of also I feel a responsibility to honor their stories and to advocate on their behalf as I promised, but also to show them in their dignity, their resilience, their strength, not as victims, but as survivors. But that again is too small a word to use to what these women have endured and continue to face. So I think I feel I cannot even begin to do them justice, but feels a small way, a drop in the ocean to which to share their stories in this way. Yeah. And paintings endure throughout years, so almost centuries even. So it's a testament to these women's remarkable resilience and dignity and what they have endured and continue to endure and overcome.
The most remarkable thing for me is when you sit with someone or listen to the testimony of someone who may have been brutalized 50 years ago, it doesn't take much for them to be there in that moment right away again. And you sort of come to realize that the only antidote, the only thing that is a hope of working, is an abundance of love. That if we show them love, if their community shows them love, if people with them show them love, that maybe can attenuate the worst aspects of this, but very hard.
I think working with love is key. I think motivated by love in the workshops with the women and that space, creating that space for the story and the small things that I've been reading a lot into the ethics of care as part of my PhD. So it's that process of your presence with the women, how that is and how that can also bring healing as well as working with love through the painting process, like that being the underlying motivation. Something I guess you have to constantly challenge and assess yourself on and kind of challenge yourself on as well. But I think it is absolutely key.
If I could take you now to the sort of broader issue of art and this particular space. So outside the Security Council, very famous tapestry representation of Picasso's Guernica is there. And I distinctly remember visiting the Picasso Museum, but also going to the Salvador Dali Museum when I was in Spain. And in Figueres, you go to the museum and there's this incredible painting that Dali painted just before, I think, the start of the Spanish Civil War. And it sort of describes a feeling which words, it would be difficult to capture exactly what you feel when you see it. It's a small post house in sunlight, but otherwise in a very gloomy setting with a phone in the foreground where the line is cut. It's as if to say the post office, the central organizing part of the human experience, while there's a sort of glimmer of hope attached to it, the line is cut, and that is going, and the clouds of the storm is moving in. So what do you think it is that artists can do in the space that others, artists, I suppose, in the broader sense, you can speak about writers, and you can speak about filmmakers and so forth. But in terms of the sort of art that you are most familiar with, how is it that they can convey something that many of us can't in reports or when briefing the Security Council and so? There is something deep within us that speaks to image, right, and imagery. Is there not?
Yeah, I would agree with you there, definitely. I think images speak to a different part of you, and paintings, like what Zainab said as well, paintings can express that which is unspeakable or unsayable, or which cannot be put to words or comprehended. And there is, and it can create an empathy and understanding as well. I think throughout history, artists have been speaking into the current moment and the current time, but how to do so and bring beauty and life as well at the same time. It just reminds me of Fra Angelico. He was painting in Florence during the plague, and his images are of beauty and light as well. So like how to use art both to speak of the hopelessness, the pain, and that we see, and the darkness that we see around us, but also bring hope and that speak of that light and that goodness and the nobility of humanity at the same time. Because and to hold both intention is it's not something I understand or something I'm learning, that's for sure. But it's a journey.
Bravo, that was beautiful. No, you do understand it. Hannah is very shortly, one hopes, will be producing her book, Tears of Gold, which will include these portraits, but others as well, and more crucially, the stories of the survivors. And so we hope all of you will find a copy when it comes out. We at IPI will be launching a Peace for Art, or Art for Peace, I should say, initiative. This Hannah was our inaugural and very distinguished artist. We hope to continue with this. So please, if you have suggestions, if you know of artists and I'm sure we can collaborate together with UNESCO and UN Women on this, and with other permanent missions, if the UK wants to continue as well, we'd be delighted. So please help us to put this together. We do think it's very important. Also, Hannah, I know you have also a certain aim, and I'd like to invite you to say it. I might be putting you on the spot, because when I spoke to you, you said, look, I don't want to be someone who's acknowledged as a great artist and see my career move in a direction, and yet your friends here are still in the situation that you saw them only a few years ago. So please share with us what your thinking is for them.
Well, I guess I've always had a dream, a quite idealistic one, that one day I'd love for my paintings to actually, I haven't actually sold these pictures because they've been used for advocacy purposes, but to be a kind of a cyclical process whereby the money earned through the art goes back to the women I've worked with. So somehow using art that has fundamentally altruistic, I guess, as a foil to the art world, which can be very much commercially driven or market orientated, not a world I really understand. But I've always had that dream, one day maybe have a foundation or something like that, or it's felt like a distant dream for a long time, but at some point in the future, that's always been, the desire
so
underpinning it.
Foundation essentially to help them.
To go back to support the women.
Yeah.
So it's not just pictures and stories, but it's actually practical, tangible support on the ground as well.
Okay, well, sign me up to be one of the first on the board, or whatever you want me to do. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, please give a round of applause to Hannah Rose Tottenham.